Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed, Conversations on Teaching and Learning. I'm Andrew Everett. This podcast is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University. I hope you will take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. And I hope you will also share this podcast with someone you think might benefit from listening to it. This is episode 23. Today, my colleague Arthur Takahashi is speaking with Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang about the classroom implications of her research in social-affective neuroscience. Here's their conversation.
Today, I have the honor to introduce Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, who is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California. Her groundbreaking research is social-affective neuroscience. In social-affective neuroscience, focuses on the crucial role that emotions play in our learning and also brain development. Dr. Immordino-Yang is the founding director of the Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education, CANDLE, at the University of Southern California. She earned her bachelor's degree from Cornell University and her master's and doctorate degrees from Harvard University. Dr. Immordino-Yang has received numerous awards for her work, including from the American Association for Advancement of Science and also the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2023, she was elected to the National Academy of Education for her outstanding scholarship in education. So Dr. Immordino-Yang, thanks so much for being on our podcast and welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Nice to be here.
All right, so in this episode, I would like to discuss your research on emotions and learning. And so that would be the first part. And the second part, an argument that you have made in this one article in your book, it's chapter 10 of your book. And it's more about technology and how to perceive and how to design digital environments for students and taking into account the role of emotions and the social context as well.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
All right, so starting with him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now you just didn't remind me which chapter 10 is, but okay, I think I know which one you mean. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll get to that one later.
Okay.
All right, so let's start with emotions and learning. And the first question that I have for you is this. So what inspired you to explore the intersection between neuroscience, emotions, and education?
Oh, yeah. Well, so I could go way back or I could just be more recent, but I mean, the most basic answer is I'm a human. And so like all humans, I have emotions and feelings, and those are deeply connected to what I think about, what I do. And I notice the same is true for my students as a seventh grade teacher. So, I mean, I think that's the silly answer, but I mean, the more serious answer is that, I did a lot of things, but one of the things I did was to be a seventh grade science teacher in a public junior, senior high south of Boston before I went back to graduate school. And I was really fascinated by the way, so it turned out that the school I was working in had like 81 languages spoken among 1,100 students. And it was like a immigrant families coming from all over the world and landing in this district. And so there were just kids from, Rwanda, it was right after the Rwandan genocide war. They were from Rwanda and East Africa. They were from Kosovo and Eastern Europe. They were from Myanmar and Malaysia, and they were from Cuba. They were from, Jamaica. They were from Haiti. They were just kids from very, very different cultural spaces, all coming together and landing in my class to learn science. And what I began to realize as I was engaging with them and about, really interesting ways to think about science and the natural world and the interconnectedness of the things we were studying, is that the kids really seemed to be trying to bring their own experience, right? They were trying to understand in a kind of intuitive, lived way, what it was that they were learning about. And they were trying to use the science and the scientific ways of thinking to try to make sense of what they were experiencing and witnessing, right? Like trying to figure out, there was a big lesson that we had that I think, really was formative for me, where we were learning about the evolution of hominid species, and kids were sort of looking around the room and wondering, why do you look like that and I look like this, right? Like, how do we get that way? And I realized that they were using the science in these deeply personal and emotional ways to try to make sense of their own experience, to try to learn about the way the world works and the way the world could work, and trying to just figure out how it is that they could use these ways of thinking to try to, kind of make sense of what was going on in these narrative ways. And that really brought home to me the importance of people's subjective emotional experiences in trying to learn and think about anything, right? Any content. And so I brought that back to Harvard with me to try to understand, the ways that thinking sort of happens, and the ways that thinking lead to learning, and learning may lead to development, right? And so, my advisor at Harvard, Kurt Fisher, used to say, cognition and emotion are two sides of the same coin, right? They're not actually separate things. They're two dimensions of how we think. And so you can sort of, and now this is me talking, not Kurt, but you can kind of watch with a cognitive lens, or you can watch with an emotion lens. But in the reality of real people's behavior, those two things are never taken apart. You can hold one relatively constant in order to study the other, right? You can say, well, don't do my working memory experiment today if your dog just died, right? That would, you're not really in an emotional place to be able to think about it, right? What that really is saying is, like, we need emotion to be about the same for everybody as they come in to do our experiment, so that we can try to watch the cognition vary, and it's not due to the fact that you're sad or something else, right? So what we've really done as scientists, which is an essential thing to do, but I think we've forgotten that we did it, so we forget to put the pieces back together again afterward, is we've taken the mind and carved it up into pieces, right? And two of those really big pieces are cognition and emotion. But actually, those are really constructs that scientists invented to be able to understand what's going on. But in real people, those two things are not two things. They're always together, and they only happen as a unified, sort of integrated mind. But that doesn't mean that we can't study one aspect or the other aspect, but to forget that when you're studying one, the other one is absolutely still there, right? It's like studying what right legs do when you're playing soccer. Well, sure, if you're right-handed, your right leg's probably making the goals and kicking things, but you can't do that without a heart, and you can't do that without your other left leg and your balance and your vestibular sense and everything contributing to how that leg works. So I like to think about emotion like that. It's really a fundamental organizer of the mind. And what we're now talking about a lot in our work, and really seeing empirical evidence for in the brain too, is that the ways that emotion is sort of organizing and driving the kinds of thinking people are doing, and young people especially, but teachers too, we're now studying them and their brains, right? The kinds of thinking that people are doing is fundamentally shaped by the way in which they feel about the thinking process, and by the sort of narrative or connection that they're telling themselves, a story they're telling themselves of what this all means and why it comes together the way it does. So the emotion is actually organizing and driving the thinking in a way that I think intuitive and progressive educators have known for a long time. But now we're starting to really explicate that from a neural perspective and understanding the brain mechanisms that really give us a deeper understanding of the way in which this happens. So the reason we study emotion is really we're not studying emotion, is what I would say. I have to say that so that all my colleagues know what I'm talking, what I mean. But I'm not studying emotion. I'm studying the mind. I'm studying how people make experience, how people think, how people learn, and how thinking and learning shapes development over time, and how development in turn enables patterns of thinking and learning. A major dimension of that is always emotion, because we are not just robots. We actually think about the things that matter. We don't waste time on the stuff that doesn't matter, which is essential. If we wasted time thinking about things that were irrelevant, we wouldn't make it, right? And the brain is very, very expensive to run from a metabolic perspective. It takes tons of oxygen and energy and stuff to do. So why would we spend time and energy thinking about things that are not relevant, right? So we only really think about the things we care about. And that is fundamental, I think, to education for us to realize that.
What you said there, we only think deeply about things that we care about, is actually one way that I start my courses, because I want my students to understand that I care about the way they're feeling about the instructional materials and the things that we're discussing in class. So I agree with you that that's so fundamental.
Yeah, great.
One of the things that you do in your research and some of your talks as well, I think you put this into perspective by talking about your daughter when she was younger. And, in my own experience with my daughter, when she was 3 years old, now she's 6, but when she was 3, she was learning about basic concepts of mathematics. And we're talking to her teacher, and her teacher said, well, Sophia's having a little bit of difficulty counting things and pulling those objects toward her. So could you perhaps work with her at home? And I had been exposed to your research already. So I'm like, I'm going to use what Dr. Immordino-Yang says and see if I can apply that at home. So what I did with her, as all kids, she loves candy, right? So I told her, Sophia, I'm going to give you 5 pieces of candy. Okay. And then I gave her 4. And then I said, count it. And she counted and pulling towards her. And she said, well, there's one missing. So she was not only counting, but then she was also doing
subtracting. Right. Absolutely.
And I think, what I like about your examples with your daughter is that it puts into perspective in a very simple way, right? But the importance of emotion for learning. The cognition and emotion are, as you said, different sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great story. I like that. Yeah.
And in some of your talks, you also mentioned the importance of putting this Frankenstein back together. And I think that's what you were alluding to, right?
Yeah. That, and I have to say, that's my dear friend and colleague, David Daniel. He's just a super clever, hilarious person and able to really think about these metaphors that are so useful. So I didn't think of that. But I've sort of run with it, right? So the idea is that, I don't know if David would say this is me now, but the idea is that, as scientists, we carve the world up, right, into little mechanisms and pieces. We try to pull them apart from each other and understand them as independent units, which is absolutely essential to understand how things work, right? I'm not at all saying we shouldn't do that. But the thing is, in education, which is really an applied field, it's not a science. It's a lived experience, right? It's filled with value judgments and with cultural ways of knowing and being. I mean, we're human beings, and we're talking about how do we raise our next generation of human beings to be who we think they should and could be, right? Like, that is a deeply subjective exercise. Let's just be clear about that from the start. When we do that, what we're really doing is taking all this science and trying to figure out, teachers are kind of stuck in the middle trying to figure out how do you put all these mechanisms and pieces together without making a Frankenstein monster in the middle, right? Because you actually don't have reading and phonological decoding ability and executive capacity and planning and emotion and okay, we put them all together and we've got, Sophia or whatever you're done. That's not who Sophia is. Sophia is a whole her who brings a whole bunch of lived experience, of desires, of proclivities, of motivations, of relationships, of emotions to the thinking. And she's all of her always at once. And what she does and learns is about her pulling all of it together in the service of her achieving and adapting, achieving her goals and adapting to the world around her that she is also changing as she does so. So it's this very emergent, dynamic, situated way in which I think about learning. And that really is that notion of we're not Frankensteins, right? We're not a bunch of evidence-based pieces that get stitched together, even though we do need to design educational systems based on what we've learned from, about how the systems work.
All right, so before we go more into depth in your research, one question that I'd like to ask you is, for you to define what emotion is, because some people mix up emotions and feelings. If perhaps you could define what emotion is and what feelings are.
Yeah. Okay. I used to talk a lot about this probably 10 years ago. I've stopped talking about it so much. Emotion proper, right? When you really, from a neuroscientific perspective, when you think about what emotion is, emotions are packages and patterns of physiological and neurological shifts in the dynamic sort of dispositions, like it's sort of what we're inclined toward. It's like as if you think about the mind and the body as a flat plane, and it's like you're pulling down a piece of that elastic fabric so that the balls rolling around are likely to go that way, right? And so emotions are a kind of a package of behaviors and physiological shifts and changes that make it sort of likely that you will think in a particular way and act in a particular way. Run away, your heart goes up, the heart rate goes up, you're right, or you hug the person and fall in love. Like emotion is kind of shifting these physiological, how much you're digesting your food, how your heart's beating, how your brain is sort of activated and deactivated in ways that make it likely that you're going to think about things in a particular way. So that's what I would say emotion is. Feelings are the experience of thinking with emotion, which all thinking is, right? So feelings they can be, are they conscious or non-conscious, whatever, doesn't matter. But the kinds of feelings that I really like to think about are the ones that we actually are dealing with when we're talking about learning and in school, right? Which are the experience of thinking, the experience in a kind of verb-like experience, right? The way I'm constructing a story of what's going on here and of how I'm living in that space and of what it means and of what I'm sort of contributing and of how others are shaping what I'm doing so that we together become a coherent sort of adaptive group. And so feelings are like stories. Feelings are, and they don't have to be stories with words. Let me make very clear. They could be painted, or you could dance them, or you just sort of, write poems about them, or you just sort of experience them and they never get formalized for other people, right? But feelings are the coherent, ongoing sort of background, and sometimes they come into the foreground of your subjective interpretation of what it's like to be in that space. So, and to think about those things. So they're really kind of a story that we're telling ourselves over time. And in that sense, and I take this from my mentor, Antonio Damasio, feelings are really a feature of consciousness. They are the ongoing coherent narrative, a narrative not necessarily in words. It could be just images. It could be, visceral experiences, but they're the ongoing sort of story we tell ourselves about what is happening and why and who we are over time.
Yeah, and you mentioned the concept there of emotions, how it helps shift the way we think about things. That actually brings me to my next question, because in your book, Emotions, Learning, and the Brain, the first chapter is a chapter that you wrote with Dr. Damasio, We Feel, Therefore We Learn.
Yeah.
And in that chapter, there are two things that you and Dr. Damasio discussed that I think is very interesting. The importance of emotion for meaningful learning. So, rote learning being something that is devoid of emotions or relatively.
It has emotion. You have to put emotion or it won't happen. There is no learning without emotion. So what do? We make it have emotion by saying, well, if you don't do this, you're going to flunk, people aren't going to like you, or you're going to get an A and everybody's going to love you, and you get to get a candy, or you don't, or a pizza party, or you don't, right? So there is emotion. It's just the emotion is not about the information you're learning. It's about the outcome and what's going to happen if you do or don't learn it, right? And that's kind of a cheap trick that standard education has used to co-opt the fact that it's impossible actually to learn things about which you have no emotion. So if you don't have any emotion about these these things, then we better make some way for you to have emotion. And that's a lot of what we've done in the modern education system. So I just wanted to point that out, right? So it's not possible to learn things without emotion. You don't do it. Yeah.
And I think that's why you use the word relatively. But
yes.
then you also mentioned that in some of your other more recent research that the role of the instructor is to help shift from emotions of outcomes to emotions of ideas.
Yes.
So that's what you mean. Emotions of outcomes would be more rote learning, and
yes.
emotions about ideas, that's what you
it's
refer
about
to
the
as meaningful
content.
learning.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yes. So, we all have emotions about outcomes to a degree, and that's fine. But so think about it this way, whatever you're thinking about is what you're having emotion about, right? Whatever you're having emotion about is what you're thinking about. Whatever you're thinking about, you could be learning about. So we need to be asking ourselves as educators, what are we having emotion about? And if the emotions are about the outcome, the being able to, like the grade, the success, the failure, the embarrassment, the pride of the final product, that is what we are learning about. And a small amount of that is okay. But if we really want to do meaningful education, we need the emotions to be about the actual content, about the physics, the math, the novel, the civic, question on the table, the perspective of my grandmother, whatever it is we're talking about, that is the deep content. The emotions have to be about that. And then that's what you're possibly learning about. So the problem is our education system is biasing people to learn about things that aren't actually the content we aim for them to know. And then we wonder why we have such high failure. Yeah.
And in that same article, you and Dr. Damasio mentioned the concept of emotional rudder, which is a little bit of what you touched on. But could you elaborate on what that term means?
Yeah. I wrote this in this was just for a little historical trip down memory lane. This was the first article I wrote with Antonio after coming to start as a postdoc, right after finishing my doctorate and having my second child. And then we're okay, let's lay out why do we think we're working together here, right? Because and this is the paper that did that. So it's old, but I mean it's still good. I still like it, but. So what's an emotional rudder? The notion of an emotional rudder is the notion that our cognition, if you do want to think about, or what I should say is the cognitive aspects of our thought processes are being organized and driven by the emotional aspects of our thought processes. So in other words, the way in which we find things interesting or curiosity invoking or frightening that first of all, relies on cognition, right? Of course you can't, because how do you know something's scary? You have to have appraised it, made sense of it, and thought, oh, wow, that could lead to this and this outcome. I'm scared, right? So you actually have to have thoughts to have emotions, but then the emotions imbue those thoughts with a kind of purpose, right? They imbue the thought with a kind of utility, with a subjectivity, a kind of personal meaning why it matters. And so in that sense, the emotions are what are kind of driving or determining the way in which the outboard motor on the back of your boat is steering the boat. So the emotions are really fundamental to the direction cognition takes. Are you going to worry about trying to get out of here? Are you going to try to save face and not be embarrassed? Are you going to try your next experiment to test the idea you had to see if that could be why this is happening the way it is in your physics experiment? Are you going to suddenly really deeply think about, that perspective on the immigration problem, I hadn't thought about it that way. Let me stop, right? Are you going to stop and think about, the information? What information is worth stopping on? And what information and how will you stop on it? Will you stop on it in a way that kind of you just react to it, and try to avoid it, run away from it, or fight with it or something? Or are you going to stop on it in a way that invites you to kind of sink into and deconstruct it in a more complex way that allows you to really appreciate the complexities of it and the nuances of it? And so in that way, you could say that emotions drive or steer or are the rudder for cognition. They're the thing off the back of the boat that swings the front of the boat around so that your thoughts go in a coherent direction. If you're mentally healthy and sane and conscious.
And the reason why I asked that is because that's a fundamental concept there, at least from that article, for some of your other more recent research.
Yeah.
But something that you also mentioned in your research, and that's something that I had not seen before when we're talking about meaningful learning. So cognitive psychologists, they usually explain meaningful learning in terms of organizing those mental models, those schemas, and then relating that or integrating that with prior knowledge. But in your research, you add a component to it. You also say that it's not just prior knowledge, but also imagined future experiences.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a great question, actually. I never really thought about it that way. But yeah, no, I mean, what are humans? What is the hallmark of a smart human? What makes us different than other animals and than 2-year-olds, right? Even though 2-year-olds do this to a degree, right? We try to really take what we've learned and use it to make some more broad or general understanding of the way things usually work. Not just ring a bell, get dog food, right? That's like what dogs do, that kind of associative learning. We do that also, right? But we try to then move beyond that and think about, wait a minute, there's a bigger pattern here, which is that something is causing me to have right? And like noticing those, for example, in that case, power dynamics or something. So those bigger ideas that are sort of inferred by making sense of many instances of specific things that happen in particular ways that you notice, that becomes the narrative. That becomes the stuff of values, beliefs, understandings. And the thing about that inference process is that it is inherently about what we would call simulating, imagining why or how or in what context this would matter, right? It does not tie itself any longer to the direct, real, physical, observable world in our immediate context. It's now about ideas, identities, beliefs, all of those things, hopes, dreams, purpose, all of those things are things that have no real physical substance. You cannot directly observe them in the most literal sense. You have to invent them, and we co-invent them with each other in a mental space that we inhabit that is deeply cultural, deeply relational, deeply social. And so that mental story space that we are all sort of living in, where we have certain expectations, beliefs, certain ways of thinking about things, those things are time independent because they're not real. They're not in the real physical space. So what that tells us is that some of the most important thinking we do is about both the integration of the past, things like identity, things like values and beliefs come from that integrated past story, and the projection of those into the future. So what do they mean for what could happen, what ought to happen, what might happen, right? So you have to invent the next thing in order to understand the implications of what you're thinking about now. And the implications, which are inherently imagined, they are inherently not real in that they haven't happened yet, become a sort of future orientation that is critical for meaningful learning. And in fact, for having a sense of purpose, right? Having a sense of hope, right? All of these things are really about what could happen next, what I might dream up, either bad or good, and how would certain kinds of events and things lead us there or not, and then what would that mean for how I understand what I'm seeing right now. So this kind of thinking about ideas is really, and the idea of narratives and feelings is really about storylines that are time travel, that allow us to move into possibility spaces. And that is an inherently motivating thing for humans. That is a core feature of our mind. that, other animals don't seem to have in the same way we do. And that feature is deeply tied neurobiologically to survival-related mechanisms. It's co-opted basic mechanisms that literally manage our physiology and our consciousness and make us remember to breathe when we're asleep, right? So it has become deeply rooted in our biology, and is kind of the thing that makes our world, our life feel meaningful and makes us feel like a real, person with actual identity and story. So it's tapping into this feature of our mind that is inherently not locked to the here and now. And that is what really meaningful learning does.
And I remember that you mentioned this in one of your publications as well, that, the brain systems that are tied to our survival are the same ones that activate when we're doing this sort of like deep thinking.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
That's why when we have those eureka moments, it feels so good.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right. Right. Yeah, it feels so good. And even if the eureka is something terrible, like you realize that could happen, right? It still is deeply motivating. So it's not about the positive emotion only. It's about the meaningfulness, the significance of something, right? And so this is why human beings can go on hunger strikes to make, a moral point. We can actually subjugate our own physical needs in the service of our mental and emotional and cultural needs. And that's something that is an extremely powerful aspect of being a person. So what feels powerful and meaningful and sort of satisfying to us is not just positively valenced things, it's meaningful things. It's things that have real implications for how we understand why things are the way they are and who are in those stories and what should be, not just what is.
And in one of your most recent talks, you also mentioned, this holy grail of education, transcendent thinking. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, transcendent thinking is what we've called it. Yeah, that's right. So transcendent thinking is basically named because, like, unless somebody's got a better name, then let me know it. But transcendent thinking is really not something that we've newly discovered, right? Scientists have talked about philosophers and artists and humans have done this for millennia, right? But there's 100 years of psychological science and developmental science and progressive education, that really highlights this kind of thinking as really important, especially in adolescence and into adulthood. But, it really is what adolescents are all about, sort of grappling with developmentally. And it basically involves, it's named like to just be easy to understand. It basically involves thoughts that transcend the current context. So they are, yes, this sort of narrative building about the why, the how, the possible futures, the historical integration to understand how we got here and what kinds of intentions are implicitly built into the relational structures, the institutional, procedures that are governing our lives. So it's the stuff of things like understanding things like the nature of democracy or the nature of values, right? These things are inherently not directly witnessable. You have to tell yourself a story about what should be, what could be, that could then be played out in any number of contexts, right? And that's the nature of what we mean by transcendent thinking. And of course, it's absolutely key for civic reasoning and things like that. We just published a paper this week, came out its final version about transcendent thinking and its role in civic reasoning. So I recommend that if anybody's interested. But transcendent thinking, we've also shown recently in teenagers, actually counters the physical growth effects in the brain that are caused by, or that are associated with, I should say, exposure to community violence and crime, right? So the degree to which a kid also thinks about those things as being part of a bigger systems level story that is bigger than just a bad person did something in that moment, right? But is about right? So what does this mean for the world, how it could be, how it should be? Those kinds of stories where kids are showing us that they're grappling with the why, the bigger picture of why things are the way they are. That kind of transcendence literally physically thickened cortices in the brain over time that violence was thinning, right? So it was actually undoing the effects of violence exposure in that sense. And then we were actually able to predict in teenagers, and this is a paper that came out in Scientific Reports, I think in March, we were able to predict a 5-year trajectory of a young person's growth by talking to them about, complex stories of real world situations that have happened to teenagers from around the world, and just ask them, all true stories with, real videos of people, ask them, how does this person's story make you feel? Right? Feel being ambiguously cognitive and affective, right? You can think things or you can emote things, right? They're both relevant. And all the kids in the study did some of this transcendent thinking, wondered about why it got that way or what it would mean for the world that they had learned that this was happening, or what it means for them personally that this is like that, right? And how they should reassess and be more grateful for their own circumstances than one kid, or how they could work harder to try to prevent those things from happening, maybe, is what another kid said, right? So the kids were showing us that as they thought in these ways, in real time, when we then moved them into the MRI scanner, we could predict, like what we said, trial by trial. So story by story, depending on how the kid had interpreted that story, we could predict what kind of brain dynamics they would show. And so we were able to actually describe these dynamical processes that are related to this transcendence. So taking something from here and now, understanding like what happened, but then going beyond to think about what does it mean in this bigger way. And then what we showed is that over the subsequent 2 years, so we had kids just rest in the scanner and we were just like daydream about whatever they want. We're watching how their brain is sort of talking to itself, like how coherent is that conversation, so to speak. And then 2 years later, we did the same thing, and we could show that the change in that conversation from the kid 2 years ago to the kid now. So you're looking at growth in a kid, not comparing kids to each other, just to be clear, right? Yep. Here's Mary Helen at 15. Here's Mary Helen's brain at 17. How has Mary Helen grown her brain across those 2 years? That was predicted by the degree to which I was inclined to do this transcendent thinking at the beginning. And then the brain growth in turn predicted identity development, like 19 years old or so, which is like not what kind of identity you have, but answering questions like, I've spent time and I think a lot about what kind of person I want to be and what I really stand for and believe in. And I think about that with people I trust and love who are around me, right? As compared to like, I don't really know right from wrong. I just kind of go along with the crowd. I rarely try things on my own. I just do what everybody else does, right? Which is not good for society or for your own mental health. And then, identity development in turn predicted life satisfaction in young adulthood. So how much kids, young adults said they liked themselves, liked the person that they've become, right? Like literally slide a slider. How much do you like the person that you've become? I love myself. I hate myself, right? Here's a whole list of people you might have relationships with in your life. Your teacher, your boss, your parent, your partner, your own child, maybe your friends, right? How satisfied are you with the quality of that relationship, right? And kids were telling us that they were more satisfied with their relationships, the better their identity had been a year before, 2 years before, which in turn was predicted by their brain growth, which in turn had been predicted by how they think at age 15 and 17, like how much they are wanting to sort of grapple with those big ideas. And not in fancy ways, right? We're not talking about using big fancy words. Kids just saying like, wait, are you telling me that the girls in the Taliban, what are they called? They don't let girls go to school? Why did they? That's not right. You know what I mean? Like it can be very basic stuff, but the fact that they stop to question and think about it is what is predicting the brain growth. And this is above and beyond the effects of IQ, right? So IQ didn't actually explain these things. Above and beyond the effects of socioeconomic status of their families, their parents' education levels, right? It's really about the kid and how curious they are to think deeply about the world. Do they actually try to make sense of what they're seeing, or do they just sort of react in the here and now? And by the way, reacting in the here and now was associated with lots of good things too. Having nice friendships and a diverse array of friends and, stuff like that, which is great. You have to be empathic and notice somebody's sad and needs a hug or whatever. But that's not going to also grow you in this way that we found transcendent thinking did.
So it's not just one or the other, but it's really
that's right. You need
both.
You need both. Yeah, you need both. But it was the transcendent, the leap to transcendence, that was really associated with this longitudinal growth trajectory. But you can't do transcendence and have unless you actually are engaged in the world here and now. So you need to have both. You need to have both. Yeah.
Yep. So that has, really big implications for education and for us educators as well, because based on your research, if we can help students develop this kind of transcendent thinking that you're talking about, we're literally helping them develop their brains, develop a better sense of happiness with their own selves, and also create better relationships.
Potentially, yes, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
responsibility.
It's a big responsibility. Being a teacher is much harder work than society gives credit for. And, so we have other work now with teachers and neuroimaging with teachers as they grade their students' work and give feedback to their students and stuff. And also we did in-depth observations of teachers in their classrooms. And we also talked to the teachers in private interviews about how they understood their work, how they understood their students and stuff like that. And what we find is that these teachers who really deeply understand that who are thinking about how the learning opportunities that they're designing in their classroom for their students are not just about the students learning things and doing things, but are also about opportunities for that person to change who they are going forward, right? Asking themselves, how are the opportunities I'm providing in my class helping this young person develop themselves as a thinker, themselves as a civic agent, themselves as a humanitarian over time? How are they helping them think about the world and themselves and put themselves in the world in a different way for having done this assignment? And when they're thinking about it that way, we see that, first of all, they have better practices by an independent team that came in and observed them. And we see that they are showing literally more brain activity when they're doing the work of teaching, when they're actually grading their own students' papers, for example, in the scanner. They were so gracious to do all this with us, by the way, as compared to grading the papers that were matched, quality papers of students they don't know, right? So there's like this work and this expertise that goes into really effective teaching. And we need to help teachers develop that. And there are many teachers and traditions of education where people are really experts at this. We did not invent this out of nothing. There are many people who deeply understand this, but they tend not to be in mainstream education settings because our mainstream settings don't value this. And they tend not to be in schools of education because our schools of education also don't really focus on this. So what we're arguing is we need to use this science and this deep practical knowledge from educators who are really developmental experts to think about what could we do differently to support the work of teachers being a different kind of work than it traditionally is thought of. And how would that change the way young people develop in the spaces of school?
All right, so if we bring your research into the college setting, right, for college faculty, what is perhaps some advice that you would give college faculty to help students develop this kind of transcendent thinking within their fields?
Yeah, and I actually think in the U.S., in many colleges, we do this quite well, right? We don't usually do it very well in K-12 education. Especially not in high school education. Of course, there are exceptions where it's done fantastically, and we're working with some of those groups. But in college, we do have good models for this. But what you really want to be thinking about as a college level professor is the same thing. How do I design curriculum, design experiences, design problems, design lab, activities, design assignments such that they develop not just kids learning things, but also kids' sort of disposition to think about the information they're learning from the perspective that I, as the expert, bring. In other words, what does it feel like to think like a historian, right? What does it feel like to think about the world and evidence like a scientist, like a dancer, like a literary, like a literature expert, right? What does it feel like to think like a scholar in my discipline? And so you want to really attend to the sort of dispositions of mind that your assignments are sort of setting young people up to engage with, not just what the outcome assignment looks like. And this is where AI is really a problem, because you have to stop and think about what is the point. Is the point of writing a paper to get a good paper, to write a good paper? Or is the point of the paper the process of thinking through, why do I think that? What do I want to talk about? Why do I want to talk about it that way? What problem is it that I want to focus on, and why? And the process of engaging in that is the assignment. That is the work. The outcome, who is ever going to read that paper again? Nobody. Nobody cares about what the final product is, right? It's the process you're engaging in. So shortchanging that process is deeply shortchanging the potential for growth in our young people, I think.
Oh, that's a great point. And we'll talk more about technology in a little bit too.
Okay.
Now to get a little bit more technical, more recently in your publications, you discuss the role of the default mode network, the executive control network, and also the salience network, and the role that they play in learning. So could you elaborate on how those three systems engage?
Yeah, so there's the new paper on civic reasoning that I mentioned that's in the Journal of Social Emotional Learning. Is open access, so anybody can get it. Or you can get it, like if you follow Candle on social media, we send all these things out. So if you want to have these things, but there's a nice discussion of it with a figure in there, for people to follow up. But the idea is that these networks, lots of neuroscience is now showing that these networks kind of, they balance with each other. They're talking to each other and regulating one another. And so what we found is that transcendent thinking involves activation of what's called the salience network, which is really the neural space of, visceral interoception, like the feeling of the inside of your guts and your heart beating and all that, right? Is kind of a platform for what matters to me, right? What should I be attending to? What is worth paying attention to? What is salient? And that activation is, you can sort of think of it as the point in the middle of a seesaw, right? And there's actually a seesaw picture in the paper, right? Where the networks of the brain are kind of balancing on that. What matters? What's going on right now? Pay attention. I'm in the middle of a soccer game. The goal's that way. Ooh, send it over here. Watching where we're doing and following the ball, right? And that's kind of, you can't be deeply reflecting on the meaning and the long-term implications of the ability to play soccer or of girls' access to sports or whatever it is, right? As you're doing that, and then sometimes the deeper meaning is what's relevant, and you have to kind of let go of your outward vigilance, watching what's going on around you, and sort of close your eyes or roll your eyes up to the ceiling. We've actually shown people do that, right? And they start to think about, wait, what are the bigger implications that transcend the here and now? Because those are what actually matter. And so those networks of the brain, it's an oversimplification, of course, but those networks of the brain are kind of balancing each other in ways that produce, neural activation and deactivation states that are conducive to these patterns of thinking. And now we need the opportunity and the content to think about so that we can really leverage those in a meaningful way that, our data suggests literally grow the brain structure over time in ways that supports mental health and well-being. And I'll also add that what's particularly interesting is that the patterns of growth that our data find, that we find in our data are associated with these outcomes are kind of the opposite patterns that others are finding are associated with mental health problems. So the kinds of things that we see strengthening and predicting liking yourself and that are weaker version, when that goes the other direction, that's what other groups are finding is associated things with anxiety disorder, mood disorders, things like that. So it really is connecting in a really deep way mental health to thinking processes that are associated with learning.
And, I really like your analogy there, using the seesaw. My understanding from your paper is that the executive control network is more about the here and now, selecting things from the environment. And then the default mode network is when we go into that daydreaming mode where we're really transcending or practicing transcendent thinking. Is that the right picture?
It could be, but I mean, you can use the default mode for anything. Like in mice, it seems to be associated with sort of integrating aspects of your lived memory. So I ran down this tube and then there was food there, but I went over here and I got my paw shocked. So don't go there, do this. And like they replay, right? So it's a kind of integration network that's involved in a lot. We had a paper in 2012 called Rest is Not Idleness, that was in Perspectives in Psych Science. That really kind of laid out what we thought that network was doing from a developmental psychological standpoint. Now, the salience network hadn't been discovered yet. It hadn't been named yet when we wrote that paper, which is interesting. But what's in there is still true, right? It's been updated a lot now, but it's still true. And that is that, the default mode is kind of, half of what the mind does. Some of it could be very productive and transcendent thinking, but it could also be mind wandering. It could also be rumination and associated with a depressive disorder, right? So these things are not networks that do transcendent thinking. They're networks that do thinking that is sort of untethered from the real physical here and now. How are you going to use those now? Are you going to use them to do really productive work? Are you going to use them to daydream, which is also healthy and useful? You kind of recapitulate and go back through and integrate things and consolidate. Are you going to use them to imagine? Are you going to use them to just kind of, just be in the here and now in a kind of way that feels sort of just settled and empty, like in certain kinds of meditation practices. So what's really key for people to know is that it's not that, what these brain regions are there or not. It's that how are you using them? Like the brains are like muscles in that sense, yeah.
In that paper, Rest is Not Idleness, the argument is that we need to give students that time to do some daydreaming, right? You
need to have that off time without the expectation where you're not training your brain that whenever I'm resting, I'm watching something, I'm scrolling on social media, I'm doing it, which pulls you into out here, right? And that is, over time can be associated with anxiety, right? Because you're like watching out here and expecting things to happen. And then you also kind of lose the strength of the inner network to kind of conjure something when there isn't something there to entertain you. In other words, you take the cell phone away, you take the entertainment away, and people feel very empty, right? That's a problem. Like you don't have enough in your own mind and your own experience and then the world around you to give you the fodder to, kind of have a mental experience. You need somebody else to keep feeding information into that. That's a problem, right? It's a problem for mental health. It's a problem for things like creativity. So you need time. And you also need to use that time in a way where you don't undermine your brain's natural ability to do this, because it is work, right? It is a kind of work, and it's easy to fall into like the addictive sort of outwardly focused thing, which we now know was designed to be addictive, right? That certain social media platforms and other kinds of information, do.
All right, so since we're talking about technology, it would be a great way to shift to talking about more technology, instructional technologies in this case, and emotions in the social context. Right. So in chapter 10 of your book, Emotions, Learning, and the Brain, you and your colleague Vanessa Synth argue that in designing digital environments, we should think of digital learning as, and I quote from the chapter, as happening through a dynamic interaction between the person and the computer. And, I got to think about this because of COVID and, all the online learning that happened during COVID, and also emergence of AI tools, generative AI like ChatGPT, as you mentioned before. But, it seems like that argument becomes more interesting and perhaps more important today. So could you elaborate on this argument?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done a lot more work on that, but I think what we need to understand is that humans' biology is fundamentally social. Our mind is it's not like we have social processing in the brain and then everything else. All of our processing is shaped by our social context, by the way we experience the world around us, by the way in which we experience relationships around us, by our own meaning that we make out of that, the stories we tell ourselves, right? Things like a sense of purpose are one of the best predictors of longevity, for example, right? Why? Because, and people who are, physically don't have, an immediate health reason so why? Because our mental stories are tied to our survival mechanisms, right? So we bring that biology, that legacy to the use of technology. We need to understand that we interpret the technological interactions from a social standpoint, and they feel to us like meaningful relationships, and they feel to us almost like people we're engaging with. This, for a lot of people, this is kind of, it's not a separate thing from what it means to be me, the way I engage with these tools. This is all me acting and adapting in the world. And I think we need to think much more about how we manage and leverage those tools for what they're good for, and minimize what they're bad for, and really take control over those things. It's not at all about like getting rid of social media or they're very useful tools, and they've been used in amazing ways to prevent injustice, to spread information, but then they can also be hijacked in ways that are either bad for the user and or bad for society. And we really need to think hard about, how we're going to use these tools in ways that are good for us, that enable flourishing and then don't undermine it. Mm-hmm.
So as instructors, if we're teaching a course online, what are some ways that we can think of, the technologies that we choose for our courses to help our student to be more transparent with our students? That's one of the arguments that you make in that particular paper. Yeah. As you mentioned, what the technology is good for, but also perhaps most importantly, how our students can interact with that technology, that environment, in a way that will avoid frustration and boredom.
I think we need to, this isn't just technological tools. This is all tools. And then this is just the tools you have inside your own mind too. I think we need to develop, proclivities and dispositions for uncertainty, for deep understanding, for complex analysis of information that warrants it, right? We need to spend time and thought trying to really engage with the complexities of situations. And oftentimes, social media is undermining that because it's giving you a quick snippet that, just grabs your attention and gives you the answer without you really thinking about, well, wait a minute, what's behind that? Why is it like that? What are the beliefs that went into that? What are the intentions? What are the motives of the people who produced that, right? So all of that is a piece of using that media responsibly. And we need to help people, not just young people, everybody learn to engage those sort of critical ways of thinking when they're engaging with these media, and use them, yes, but also really start to systematically query them and expect them to serve us in ways that are helpful and undermine their ability to harm us.
Now I would like to transition to our last question, which is also our continuing the conversation question. And this is the question. So can you give us a glimpse of what you're researching right now, and maybe, how your research now could be helpful to college faculty?
Yeah. Okay, sure. So we've got tons going on. So what we're writing up right now are these studies of high school teachers, brain activity, what they do in the classroom, how their youth in their classrooms experience that, their physiology in the classroom, right, their understanding of things. So really starting to build out pedagogical materials based on what we're learning about the work of expert teaching. And so we're doing that. That is with junior and senior high school teachers, but it also applies to college level teachers for sure, because we're talking about, adolescents, and adolescents are still adolescents in college. So that we're studying. We're figuring out how we want to replicate the study with the teenagers, showing the power of transcendent thinking, but also we want to extend it to look at how transcendent thinking really shows up in disciplinary domains. What does it look like in math, in science, in literature, in the arts, in the civic domain, which there's lots of work out there on these things, but we want to sort of tie it together to the brain mechanisms to really kind of shed some fundamental insight on the roles that environments can have in shaping young people's proclivities and dispositions to engage in these transcendent ways of understanding. And we're doing a lot of, we're about to launch. I can't quite talk about it yet because the paperwork is literally going to be finalized today, I think. But we're about to launch a major new initiative where we are starting to really change, hopefully, how we think about teacher education and the work of teaching. So look out for that. There'll be opportunities. We're going to be working with expert teachers who are really interested in what we're calling metabolizing the science with us. So in other words, not us applying science to education, not us translating science for education, but us thinking with expert educators about, how we can, if we sit down and start to understand what we're discovering about the nature of learning and development, how would we then, sort of chew that up and turn it into nutrients and energy in various kinds of educational spaces, including post-secondary educational spaces. So that's why I'm calling it metabolizing the science, as compared to us coming in and telling you what we've discovered and what it means for what you should do. So we're going to have major initiatives on teacher education and professional development that are just about to come. And if you're really interested in contributing to that work too, feel free to reach out. There will be application opportunities soon, but feel free to reach out at the Candle website, and somebody will get back to you.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who would like to follow your work, how could they follow your work and follow,
Yeah, well, I'm not really the social media type. I don't really have any personal profiles on social media at all. But I have a team now that has convinced me that I should. So they are managing all that. So you can go to X, I guess it's called now, and follow us at Candle. And you should get information. You can follow Candle on LinkedIn, or I guess me personally on LinkedIn is how LinkedIn works. You can also go to our Candle website, which is candle.usc.edu, which we are actively revamping and really going to start putting some much more up-to-date content on there as we're moving. But you can still go there now and get any recordings or of talks I've given, or papers we've done, or other kinds of reports that have come out that might be of use to you. So I would say follow us. And then also feel free to go to the website and check things out, pop around, and take what you want. Yeah.
All right. And the newest research that you're working on, will that be also linked on your Candle website? Yeah,
for sure. And if you follow us, we'll send out the papers as they become available. And I'm really trying very hard to make sure that everything is open access so that anybody can access it. One of our papers right now, I found it isn't. The Weaving a Colorful Cloth paper was the opening paper for this year's Review of Research and Education volume. And it's basically about, recentering education. It's about this Copernican shift, recentering education on the experience of the learner, and 5 principles that describe what experiences of learners actually are that contribute to learning and development over time, and that education should be recentered around. That paper is behind a paywall, but we're working on that. But if you write to us, we can give it to you. Yeah. If you can't get behind the paywall. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
Dr. Immordino-Yang, thank you so much again for being on our podcast. It was a pleasure talking to you, and an honor as well.
Great. Likewise.
Join the conversation and connect with us on Facebook at facebook.com/AUGCII. And visit our show page at augusta.edu/innovation to access resources discussed in this episode, discover more episodes, or to get in touch with us. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.